Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, virtual demo of the Doppler Flow Velocity System. Today, Sydney Menson's going to run the Doppler Flow, and I will host the webinar. Should you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A dialog box, and I'll work through those questions as we go through the demo as much as we can with Sydney, and then any that we're unable to answer, we will answer at the end. Should you have any technical issues, please do use the chat window, and my colleagues will help to resolve those. We will have about an hour together today, so we'll run through as much as we can in the live demo, and again, any questions at the end. The session is being recorded and will be sent out at the end. So if you have any trouble hearing anything or want to share it with your colleagues, do know that you will get the recording in a couple of days' time. To start though, I would like to give a brief few slides on the Doppler Flow Velocity System. So this system that we're going to look at today non-invasively evaluates the cardiovascular function of different animal species. Today we're going to look at mice, but there is an option to use the system on rats and similarly sized animals. The system consists of 4 different components, and we'll see each of those today. But the first is the transceiver. This is what sends and receives the sound. The Doppler digitizer, this is what's going to digitize the signal coming from the transceiver, the workstation software on the computer, and then the handheld probes. And so there is both a 10 and a 20 megahertz probe. When using Doppler, frequency of sound has to do with depth of penetration and temporal resolution. So as much as we want to have high temporal resolution because the animal's hearts are beating very quickly, we would use the 20 megahertz probe for the mice, and the 10 megahertz probe, which would penetrate deeper, we would use on the rats. The system also comes with a heated surgical platform. It's called the rodent surgical monitor, and that allows us to have real-time integration of the ECG signal, and we'll see that today, with the Doppler flow signal so that you can align what's going on in terms of the electricity in the heart and the ECG signal with what's going on in the flow, and knowing that we're in true systole or diastole, depending on what flow we're looking for. The platform itself is also heated, and you can monitor the temperature of the animal, so that allows us to maintain physiological conditions within the animal. And then the probe itself is about 2 millimeters in diameter. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit where angle becomes important, but having such a small probe does allow us to have a nice small angle when measuring the blood flow velocity. So when we do want to measure blood flow velocity, we are using a Doppler technique. So what we want to do is have the Doppler probe, as you see here, as in line with blood flow as possible. And that's because when we want to calculate velocity, the angle between the blood movement and the probe itself, where the sound is coming from, comes into play. And the smaller that angle, the more accurate and reproducible the velocity measurement will be. Now in the software, there is an angle correction that can be applied, but as this angle gets past 15 or 20 degrees, then we introduce a lot more error into the measurements that we're doing. So best practice is to have as small of an angle as possible when doing Doppler imaging or Doppler analysis, and keeping that consistent between your measurements. The advantages of using pulsed wave Doppler is that it is non-invasive, so we can do longitudinal studies. You'll see we'll have a live video feed coming from Sydney using the system on the animal, and you'll see that there's no shaving of the animal. She simply uses a little bit of water, and the acquisitions are quite simple and quick to acquire. So again, non-invasive, short acquisition times. We can do measurements at various locations. So today, Sydney will walk through a number of different signals, for example, the outflow from the mitral valve or the inflow from the mitral valve, the aortic outflow, the aortic arch, the coronary artery, carotid arteries, and then we'll also take a look at doing some pulse wave velocity measurements as well. So with that, signals from 2 different sites can be combined so that we can figure out how fast that pulse of blood is traveling through the vasculature. We can achieve those very small angles using the small probe, and Sydney will demonstrate that today. Knowing how to be at the right location, and we'll talk through this as Sydney is doing some of the imaging today, is that we have to have a knowledge of the anatomy. We need to know what vessels we want to look at, what direction the blood is flowing, and have a sense of what the shapes of the waveforms that we're looking for. So often having this as template to work from is really helpful for those who are learning to understand what the shapes are that we're looking for. And we'll talk about that today as Sydney gets those signals again. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about systolic and diastolic function. We'll talk as we take a look at either the aortic arch or the carotid arteries, how we can use the Doppler flow to confirm and stratify different surgical models such as TAC or transverse aortic constriction. We will look at coronary flow, and that can be used to look at coronary flow reserve. We'll look at pulse wave Doppler as a measure of arterial stiffness. And then we'll look at some peripheral vessels to look at flow in those as well. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to have Scintica turn on the camera so that we can watch Sydney do the preparation. She's just setting up the animal on the surgical monitor system. So she started first by anesthetizing the animal. We are using isoflurane here with an oxygen tank. She's secured the animal onto the surgical platform. So again, the platform is heated. She's taped the paws down to the ECG leads, and that provides us with the ECG signal into the Doppler flow system. She's using a rectal probe to monitor the temperature so that we know how the animal is doing, and the respiratory signal is also visible. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to have Sydney share the screen with the software from the Doppler flow system. Great. So again, as we go, please feel free to ask any questions that you have. I'll keep that dialog box open up on my computer, and as appropriate, I will ask Sydney the questions that you have, and we'll work through the answers on those. Okay, so Sydney's got the animal taped down, again, anesthetized with isoflurane. Keeping the surgical or the plane of anesthesia quite light because we do want the heart to beat as fast as possible. And on the monitor for the rodent surgical monitor, you can actually see that the heart rate is about 487 beats per minute, which is nice and fast. Sydney will watch the isoflurane level just to make sure the animal's doing well. And what we can see is that the ECG signal that we see on the tablet is fed into the software of the Doppler Flow Velocity System, so that as we start to acquire image or spectrums and velocity flows, that will line up with the ECG signal. So Sydney, if you want to show everyone the probe, just so we get a sense of how small it is. Okay, so that's the Doppler probe there. So it's quite small, about 2 millimeters in size. It both sends and receives the sound. And all we need to do is have a little bit of water in place for the signal to be sent and received through the animal. So there's no need to remove the hair off of the chest or the area that's being looked at. And I think to start, we were going to do the mitral valve. To start, so Sydney, I can obviously hear her. So as much as she's saying anything, I can convey that to you guys as well. Okay, so to start, Sydney's just going to set the depth on this remote. So that basically is going to show how far from the tip of the probe that we're listening for the sound signal to be coming from. Okay, and so for each measurement, there's a specific setting that we use as a guide, but that all depends on the species you're working with, of course, and the size of that animal. So I'm putting a little bit of water underneath the rib cage. We're going to look for the mitral valve flow. So she'll come up through the apex of the heart and direct the probe at the animal's left ear to be able to get a good signal. So once we put the probe in place, you'll start to see some of the signal coming across on the screen. Okay. And so Sydney's going to make small movements with the probe and change the depth if she needs to get the mitral valve flow. Okay, so we're starting to see the flow in the positive direction. So that's going to tell me, ironically, she has the tricuspid valve there with the E and the wave shorter, the E wave shorter than the A wave. And we'll talk about what E and A wave means when we get the mitral valve flow. So if we think about the mitral valve and the left ventricle specifically, when the heart is fully contracted, at the end of systole, it then begins to expand or relax and then passively pulls the blood from the atrium into the left ventricle. Okay, so that's going to be our E peak or our early peak. And then the atrium is going to then contract and push the rest of the blood out of the atria into the left ventricle. So these E and A peaks tell us a lot about the diastolic function of the animal. And so the E peak in the mitral valve is typically higher than the A peak, and the ratio between them becomes really important. In the tricuspid valve, the opposite happens in the right ventricle. And so typically we would see a lower E peak than A peak, which is some of the signal that I was seeing on Sydney's image there. So Sydney's making small movements with the remote to change the depth, and then also making small movements with her hand to get the mitral valve. Okay. Okay, so now we're getting a stronger signal coming through. And again, each mouse and each strain and the size is going to depend on the depth of penetration. Okay, so there's different flows that we're seeing, and you can probably hear through my microphone, you can hear the traditional sound of the Doppler flow. So that's coming through the computer, and often we can recognize the different flow velocities that we're seeing based on that signal and the sound that we're seeing without even looking at the screen. Okay, so I'm going to give Sydney a quick hand. So just bear with me as I get my microphone pulled over. Perfect. You're connected. Alrighty. Okay, so again, different strains and different mice, and these are strains that we're not typically used to working with. So again, I'm just going to take the probe, locate the xiphoid process. I'm going to come right up underneath the xiphoid process and angle towards the animal's left ear. Okay. This mouse is not So the signal I just had looked very much like the tricuspid valve because again, that E wave was very short and the A wave was very long. So that would tell me that I was looking at the right side of the heart, which This guy is not where I would have expected. Okay. Okay. I'm going to say his heart is probably in a different place that we're not used to in the heart, in the chest cavity. That is all. Okay. Can you just give me this chair? Okay. Okay, there's a very consistent tricuspid valve flow. Okay. So I'm just going to take my signal, my probe, and make a small movement. Okay. And let's do it this way. So there's different ways that you can come in with the probe. You can either come from the apex like we were, or you can take the probe and come in up over the collarbone. And so with the heart angling this way, and I want to see the flow from the atrium into the left ventricle. So that's our aortic out. No, that's our going away from, that would be pulmonary, yeah. This is actually the aortic outflow based on the way that my probe is positioned. So with my probe changing positions, blood flowing towards the transducer, as would be going through the aorta, is going to be in the positive direction. So from here. Great, so I'm actually gonna have Sydney put down the other mouse. I'm fairly confident based on what we're seeing is that this heart isn't in the place that we would normally expect it to be. And for the purposes of the demo and showing you the system, I would like to try our second mouse. Okay, so we will see a nice strong signal from the aorta. So this is our aortic outflow. So again, we're seeing a nice strong signal moving in the positive direction. From there, you'd be able to measure the velocity and area under the curve and get some measurements in terms of timing intervals. Okay, we will have to take the isoflurane off this animal to anesthetize the other one. Okay, and we'll stop the video for this point. I will attempt one last time to get the mitral on this guy before he wakes up. You've got the ISO there, yeah? Okay. So again, unless this animal, and again, we're at a local lab, so this is not necessarily a strain that we're familiar with. The E peak is very low. if that's the mitral valve. It's where I would expect the mitral valve to be. But in the interest of the demo, again, we're going to put down another mouse and see. It's a cage mate, so hopefully they have better signals for us. And this is what transpires in a live demo. So sorry, just bear with us. Excellent. So if we want to turn the camera back on, we can actually see the preparation steps. So Sydney's just taken the animal out of the anesthesia chamber. Okay, she's putting him into the nose cone. And then we'll start to tape the paws down. So there's a little bit of ECG gel on each one of the leads. And then we'll just use the tape to secure the paws. Perfect. So once the paws are taped down, we'll start again with that mitral valve signal. We had pre-scanned one of the animals in the cage. This isn't the same one that we did already. And the mitral valve flow looked fantastic. So we're hopeful that our signals will be, as they normally are, easy to acquire and not giving us the challenges of that last mouse. Okay, so now we can start to see the nice strong ECG signal on the screen. And then we'll just monitor the temperature to make sure that the animal's keeping a nice physiological level. So we can see the heart rate's about 520 beats per minute. And what we should see when we get the mitral valve, as we did on that last animal though, is that those E and the A peaks would be separated. So again, the E peak is the passive filling from the atria to the ventricle as the ventricle begins to relax. And the atrial kick is basically what pushes the rest of the blood out of the atrium into the ventricle. Measuring the ratio between those and the timing intervals that take place will tell us a lot about diastolic function. So we can measure, again, the peak velocity on each peak, as well as timing intervals, including the isovolumic relaxation and isovolumic contraction times. And when we get the signal, I'll point those out to you, but they're basically the times in which there's no blood flow. So we'll see a flat line, and that tells us that the muscle is working to either contract or relax, but no change in blood flow has happened up to that point. Okay, so placing the Doppler probe on, we can start to see some signals. And within the software, all of the measurements are built in. So you would be able to make the measurements and get the calculations out of the information that you're looking for. So we're starting to see a nice strong signal there. Okay, so we see a nice strong E peak. The A peak has an odd shape, but again, these are mice that may or may not have a normal genotype. So this is the challenge that we face at times with the animals that we have access to. But I'm gonna see if Sydney can dial that in a bit better. Okay. Do you want to try and do coronary instead? Okay, so let's, yeah, coronary or aortic outflow, you pick. Okay. Coronary, okay. So Sydney's now going to move and do the coronary artery. So here we're looking at the left anterior descending coronary as it comes out at the aortic root. So if we know our anatomy, the aortic root, the left anterior descending, the LAD comes out quite nicely straight out, and it would actually be going almost straight towards the armpit, basically the left armpit of the mouse. And so by placing the probe, the way that Sydney has it oriented is the mitral valve. So here we're actually seeing quite a nice strong signal of the mitral valve, the E and the A peak, as we talked about before. So these hearts are obviously shifted in the chest. Because this would not be the view that we would typically take. But again, it comes down to learning and understanding your strain of animal and any modifications that you have to them to figure out exactly where you're going to see those signals. Nothing's ever simple. So that could mean that finding the coronary might be tricky, although I suspect it's going to be in a similar area to what we're used to. Okay, so you'll see the little blue box to Sydney's left-hand side, that's the range. So again, that's the depth from that probe head that we're listening for the signal. You just have a nice shape of it as you pulled the probe back. So you may want to decrease it. Yeah, good. So the, you're getting really close there. The coronary has a very characteristic appearance, and it also is shifted in the ECG signal because the coronary flow actually happens during diastole when the muscles relax and flow can actually go through those vessels. So that's the important part of having that ECG signal lined up, is that we can confirm that the signal that we're seeing has the right characteristic shape that we're used to, but also that it's happening in diastole and not systole. You're super close there. So it almost, I say it almost looks like a church. It's got a little kind of building off to the side and then a strong spike up. And this can be used to look at coronary flow reserve. This is how much can the heart respond to stress? So how much can those coronary vessels dilate to bring more blood flow to the heart in times of stress? And how we do this is we actually make this measurement both when isoflurane levels are high and when they're low. And so we take the ratio between those. And we'll show you a bit later, if time allows, that there's a micro positioner that would allow allow the probe to be held in position. So it basically clips onto the side of the chamber. There's a really nice one. It clips onto the side of the platform and holds the probe stable so that as you were changing the isoflurane levels, you would be able to watch and monitor the change in peak velocity of the coronary signal. Okay, I'm just going to pause that for us. Perfect. So this is very characteristic flow. So basically what we're looking at is a nice strong spike and then the signal coming down here. And it would be the peak velocity that we'd be looking at to do that coronary flow reserve. And again, the micropositioner that we'll show you later would hold that stably in place throughout the imaging. So now you want to move to aortic outflow? Perfect. Great. There is also a foot pedal. We don't have it connected, but the foot pedal can be used so that basically as you push it, it would save the images that you had just acquired or the spectrums that you had just acquired onto the computer. So you can do it hands-free and use your hands to take the images. Okay, so now we're looking at the aortic outflow. So you can see Sydney's probe has moved up basically on top of the collarbone, and we'll now be looking for blood going in the positive direction or going towards the transducer. Okay, and on the y-axis of the spectrogram that you're seeing, on the left-hand side, we can see the frequency of the sound, and then on the right-hand side is the velocity. And again, it's just a simple equation to get from frequency of sound to velocity. And so that's why those scales kind of correlate to one another. So again, we're looking for a very strong spike upwards with the aortic outflow, which Sydney is bringing in right now. And at this point in the vascular tree, we will see everything in diastole going back down to 0. And that's because there is no flow through the aortic root or the aortic valve in diastole. As we get further down in the vascular tree, for example, in the renal artery, you can pick up that there's still diastolic flow, and that's because of the increased resistance within those vessels. Okay, so we're getting a nice strong signal here. Okay, so what we're looking for here is a very strong spike up and then coming all the way down. The black that you're seeing in the center is actually a feature that we look for. It tells us that we're right in the middle of the vessel, and it shows that we're measuring laminar flow so that everything's going at the same speed in the same direction. If you had stenosis or something that was disturbing the flow, you would be able to see turbidity in here. So you'd probably see an increase in velocity, but also this loss of laminar flow. The little tick that you're seeing down here after systole is actually the closure of the valve. So as the valve closes, it pulls back a little bit of blood with it, and we can actually see that. We use that as a landmark to know that we're always measuring in the same location within the animal, so we can be very reproducible in the images that we're taking. Okay, so now we want to move to aortic arch. Perfect. So a little bit further down the vascular tree. So the last image that we took was from the ascending aorta, basically at the aortic root. Here we would be taking a measurement from the aortic arch. So we'll see a little bit of a difference in shape. If you had a TAC model, you could use this to look at the velocity through stenosis. And there is an approximation of the pressure across that stenosis that can be made using Bernoulli's equation. Okay, so you'll see that Sydney's coming basically up underneath the armpit. The blood should be flowing towards the transducer. So we are looking for a positive signal, which we're seeing come in and out. Okay, so there's a very nice strong signal. The sound I can hear quite well. It's very characteristic. It's a very sharp sound. Okay, you can also approach this from the other side, but traditionally we will do it in the positive direction. Okay, so again, if you had stenosis here, you would see an increase in the velocity, as well as the sound changes almost entirely. It becomes very static-like rather than the sharp piercing sound that we hear. Okay. There we go. Okay, so that looks really nice. I'm just going to scroll over. Thank you. Perfect. Okay. I'm operating Sydney's computer and she doesn't have the tap that I'm used to with my trackpad. So we will work with this. So again, we see the nice sharp incline on systole, but we don't have as sharp of a decline as we start to move down the vascular tree, and we can see some trailing out here. We also lose that tick in the negative direction. So again, this tells me that we're further down in the vascular tree, and in time we'll get down to the abdominal aorta and we'll see that that looks very different. For now, we're going to go up and we're going to look at the carotid arteries. So again, with the TAC model, if you were to do the carotid arteries, they should look very different because the TAC should be placed between the innominate and the left common branch of the aortic arch. So if you're looking at the right carotid artery, you would actually see an increase in velocity because the pressure built up by that stenosis is quite strong. And so you'd see an increase in velocity within the innominate artery or the right common carotid artery. You would then see a lower velocity in the left common carotid artery. Okay, and so what we'll see here, this is a normal animal, he doesn't have TAC, but we will see a strong systolic, but then we will also see some diastolic flow, and that's because of the resistance as you move up into the brain on those vessels. And so also built into the software is the ability to measure the resistive and pulsatility indices of vessels. And so you make some simple measurements in the spectrogram, and then the software would calculate that for you. And so we're seeing hints of the coronary coming in. Again, we're looking for blood flowing in the positive direction just based on Sydney's hand position. So she's just off to the side of midline. And so here we're seeing a nice carotid signal coming in. There we go. Very nice. Okay, I've paused it, Sydney. You're good. So if we click down here, so again, we see a very strong signal coming up during systole, and then through diastole, we do have consistent flow. So again, there's measurements can be made at different velocities in terms of peak and lower velocities that the system would give you measurements of resistive and pulsatility indices. So I think at this point we had planned to do pulse wave velocity. Yep. Okay, so pulse wave velocity is basically taking a look at measuring how fast the pulse of blood is flowing through the vascular tree. So we can relate back to arterial stiffness. So if the vessels are more stiff, then the blood pulse is going to travel faster. The benefit of the Doppler flow system is there's actually two channels on that transceiver. So Sydney can have two probes plugged in simultaneously. And what she's setting up now is to actually receive and display both of those signals at the same time on the computer. So one will go in the positive direction, the other one will go in the negative direction. She's also going to connect the micromanipulator because Sydney only has two hands, like most of us. She can't hold both probes stable, rotate it 180 degrees. So this clip, yep, goes like that. So she'll set up one on the abdominal aorta using the micropositioner. So the probe will slip into the positioner, she'll get it into position, and we'll see that signal continuously show up on the screen. And then using her hand, she'll position the abdominal aorta. So we want to be as far apart in the vascular tree as we can. And so we go from the aortic arch to the abdominal aorta just below the renal bifurcation. And so what we're able to do on the software is then measure how fast it takes the pulse to travel, and we'll show you how we determine that. And then we can use calipers to measure how far those two probes are from one another in making the measurement. And in doing that, we would then get the pulse wave velocity, or in meters per second. As the arteries stiffen, perhaps with age or disease or treatment of a drug, then we can measure that. Okay. So the micropositioner has a multi-locking mechanism in which there's a knob that Sydney can turn that tightens each connection sequentially, if you'd like. You got it? It's okay. Okay, so we should see the signal from this probe come out through the negative signal. So we're losing information about directionality of flow, but we are keeping velocity and the timing of the signal. Okay, so as soon as Sydney gets a nice signal, she'll lock that in. What she's seeing there is actually venous flow moving into aorta, into arterial flow. There we go. Okay. That's venous flow. So it's non-pulsatile, but there's still a velocity associated with that, where a small movement over, so going from the vena cava to the aorta, is a small shift, but it's a very different waveform that we're looking at. Okay, so I'm just going to change Sydney's scale on how are you doing that? I can't make your scale bar change. I'm going to get Sydney to do it. She's more familiar with her computer, but you can see that now Sydney has no hands on the system at all, but she's very able to use the micro positioner to maintain that signal throughout. Yep, that looks good. Okay, and then she's going to take the second probe and get the aortic arch signal. Okay, and then what we're going to take a look at is the timing interval between when that peak comes off the baseline and when it reaches the other probe. Good. Okay. Yep. Channel B to how deep? Down? Deeper? Or lower? Yep. Very good. Okay, so you can start to see the signal coming from Sydney's second probe in the upper direction. So we'll just get a nice strong signal on both. Do you want it less deep? You want it to go deeper? Okay. Okay. Okay, so it's at 6 now. So I'm just adjusting the depth from this probe because we have the remote plugged into the other channel at this point. Okay. Okay. Do we go more shallow? Okay, there you go. Okay. That's okay. So if we go, if you want to expand, you can run it better. So let's go to a strong signal that's closer to the end. Yep, and then expand your time interval, for example, on this one. Okay, so down here, we can actually change the timing interval. And so as we do that, you can start to see the difference in velocity. So on the top probe she had on the aortic arch, we can see when it starts to come off the baseline. So that shows us when that pulse of blood hit that probe. It then traverses down the aorta and gets to the abdominal aorta, and it comes down through here. So basically we just need to measure that time interval, and then we have the caliper measurement from where those probes were located, and we can get the measurement of pulse wave velocity. Again, as the animal ages, as it gets older, those things are going to change due to arterial stiffness. So this is a really great way to measure it. Other ways can involve doing sequential measurements of flow at the arch and at the abdominal aorta. They can be less accurate, perhaps more susceptible to changes because there's changes over time and how the animal's heartbeat is going. Small changes make a big difference. So doing it sequentially with two probes simultaneously, or sorry, doing it simultaneously with two probes on the same system is really the best way to make this measurement. And there's a number of different papers published using that technique. Did we want to do any other flows? I can't think of any that we've covered. Sure. So we'll try the mitral flow again. If anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A dialog box. Oh, sure. Yep, okay, so we'll try this one again to get a stronger outflow signal coming from that top. So when you change the scale and time too far, it's a little crazy. Okay, so again, if anyone on the demo has questions, please put them into the Q&A dialog box and I'll work through them with Sydney as we go. Yeah, that one's nice. Yeah, perfect. So then we can zoom in on, that's okay. You can zoom in really nice and far, and I'll zoom over. So here we can see really clearly that measurement. So you would start the measurement here and go to here. Okay. I don't know if you wanted to show that time measurement, just so they can see how small of a time gap that is. Just make a quick time measurement there. Yeah. Can you do a simple just time interval? Sorry, I popped this on, Sydney. I forgot how the measurement package worked. Okay. We'll send a follow-up with this, but it's really just a few nanoseconds.
So I believe it's a calculation you have to do.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, we found the caliper mode that I was looking for. So then put a second point. Yep. And then you get your time interval between those. Yeah. So we're just looking at the 7 milliseconds. So that's the time between those 2 points. So that would tell us how long it took the pulse to traverse. And then we use the caliper measurements to get the distance. And then we can get a velocity from there. Okay. perfect. No worries. I did not explain myself well. Perfect. Did you want to try the mitral one last time? We got about 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. Right, okay. So Sydney's going to unswitch the cords at the back. So it's just unplugging and replugging one cord at the back and then a small change within the software so that it's not looking to display the signals on top and bottom of each other. And then we're back to our normal viewing angle. Perfect, got it. Yep. Okay, so she still has the probe coming up underneath the xiphoid process, pointing towards the animal's left ear. Our heart rate is still at 480 beats per minute, so a nice high heart rate. Okay, so there's one little peak there. Scintica, is there anything in the chat window? No? Okay, perfect. Try it. So Sydney's going to just take a different approach and come from the top, where we saw it when we were doing the coronary. She actually saw a really nice mitral signal, which is coming in here as well. So again, these mice, their hearts are apparently not in the regular position that we're used to seeing. So we're getting quite a nice mitral signal there. Okay, so in this view, we're actually looking for both the mitral and the aortic outflow. And once we get a nice signal, I'll explain why. But it has to do with different timing intervals. So we want to see both signal going above and below. So we should be looking for a nice, strong negative signal for the mitral valve flow from here, yeah? Yep. It's interesting. You're still seeing a lower E peak than the A peak. So we'll have to... So we do have one question. The question is, can you use and record from more than 2 probes at the same time? So we have in the past had a system that had, I think, 3, and there is talk of a system that would have 4 probes simultaneously to look at flows through different areas. So that was something that was custom made, but obviously it's been made, delivered, and the customer is using it repeatedly. So it's something that we can definitely talk further about if appropriate, but yes, you can. Okay, if there's any other questions, we'd be happy to run through them. But I think what I'm actually seeing is mitral flow based on where you are, with a lower E than A peak. So what we saw as the reverse of what we expected on both the first and this mouse, I think is actually, there's a phenomenal coronary artery, sorry. That is a fantastic coronary artery view. Of course, she's taking the same approach. And if you know the anatomy, that's fantastic. So very nice strong peak velocity with that very characteristic appearance. And then we see where it sits within the ECG signal. So we know it is in fact happening during diastole. So as we go, we'll point out the signals that we see. But given what we're seeing and where Sydney is, I actually think what we were seeing as having a low E and a high A peak all throughout is actually the mitral valve in these animals. So these are animals that are coming from a breeding colony with a specific genetic mutation. These ones are supposed to be transgenics, but with not the full genotype that they're looking for. But it looks like there's some differences going on in these hearts, which we weren't necessarily expecting. But again, the fun things that we run into when doing a live virtual demo. One of the last things we want to do before finishing up, I'll leave Sydney's screen being shared, but I'll launch a poll on the screen. We can start doing demos in the US and throughout Canada. So if you would like us to bring the system, come to your lab and work with you and the animals models that you have, we'd be happy to do so. So please let us know if that's something that you'd like. We'll reach out and we'll organize something for a future date that works for everyone. Okay. Perfect. So Sydney's moved back to the more traditional approach. And as we come to the end of the demo, it looks like she had some nice mitral flow signal. Right. Okay, note that the heart rate is 488 beats per minute. So getting the separation on the E and the A peak is really great and is something important for those doing diastolic function to see, and we are seeing that here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Again, any last minute questions as we go through? Please let us know. If not, please reach out to us at info@scintica.com and we'd be happy to talk further with you about the research that you're doing. If you come up with questions that you'd like us to answer in the coming days and weeks, please reach out. And again, we'll follow up with some more information in the days to come. Thanks again for everyone's time today.